How are you doing? Doing okay? Yeah? Did you have a good week?
Yes.
So? Did you see the snow this morning?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I think if I worked really, really hard, I could have made a snowball. There was enough. Just enough on my car. Of course, not on the ground, but it was on my car. I have this question about new things. I don't know if you're like me, but there's this attraction that I have to new things. Something that's, I don't know why that is. But I took my car in to get an oil change this past week, and I go to the dealership because they have a discount at the dealership. And so just to pass the time, I went out on the lot to see what the new 2016 models look like. And that was just a big mistake. Because all of a sudden I'm thinking, man, I need a new car. Because these things just look so nice. And my car, which is a perfectly good car, just didn't measure up. And you're thinking, wait a minute. Because I felt that way about this car. Almost a betrayal, right? I felt like I loved my car until I saw the new car, and then my old car, it just didn't measure up. And so that's the way it is, right, in our lives sometimes, that we have these things, that the thing that's new and fresh today, the thing that we think we can't live without today, becomes that tired, old, familiar something or other the next day, right? We're just fickle people. That's the way we are. We go up and down in our lives, and we sometimes aren't sticking with our commitments and what we think is really important. And that's kind of the way it is sometimes in our faith, in our Christian walk. And so I want to ask you to kind of remember, if you can, go back to the moment that you committed your life to Christ. I don't know when that was or how that came about, where you were, who you were with. Was it after hearing a sermon? Was it with a discussion with a friend? Was it, kind of after reading the Bible by yourself? I don't know where you were. But can you picture it? Do you remember that moment when you made a decision, when you said in your heart or out loud, I am going to follow Christ? I was 15 years old when I was baptized by my grandfather. Now, I put off committing myself to Christ for intentionally, actually. I had this plan, because I was, as a teenager, and I had this kind of simplistic view of faith and how grace worked and all that kind of stuff. And my plan was this, basically, was that I was just going to go ahead and live my life the way I wanted to live, because I knew, if you committed to Christ, you have to follow God. I said, I'm just going to go ahead and live my life the way I want to. And then when I was old and near death, maybe around 40, then I would go ahead and get baptized and be forgiven of all my sins that I committed living my own way. And that was kind of my plan. I was going to kind of do my own thing. But the summer of my 15th year, I was spending that summer with my grandfather and living with him, and we took this fishing trip. And so we're out there fishing, and my grandfather begins to ask me all kinds of, uncomfortable questions. He's kind of a blunt guy, or he was. He said, "What are you waiting for?" And I couldn't tell him that I didn't believe, because I did. And I can't really remember all the lame excuses I gave him, but I was trying to put him off as desperately as I could with some kind of reasoning. But little did I know, after we returned from that fishing trip, he had a talk with the preacher, and he told him some stuff, and had him preach a sermon directly at me. I didn't know this till later on, but it was odd, because that sermon was like hitting every single point that was in my life. I was like, wow, this is bizarre. I felt the tug of God's call on my heart as I was hearing this sermon this Sunday morning. But I was also a very shy young man, and there was no way I was getting up in front of 100 people and committing my life to Christ in front of those people. So I was like, I put it off again. And so I'm standing out in front of the church just waiting to go home, and my grandfather comes up one more time, and he looks at me, and he says, "What are you waiting for?" I'm like, The only thing I could think of at that moment was, because I really, didn't have, I was like out of all my shoes. He said, "Well, I want to go back home so that my mom and dad can see me get baptized." I was like, I want to wait. He says, "When God calls you, you come. You don't wait." And so there on that day, at that moment, we went back into the church and gathered the people that were left there, and I got baptized. And I remember that moment when my grandfather baptized me. And the feeling of grace that overwhelmed me, I'll never forget it. It was so amazing. It was this feeling of being clean and new and fresh, redeemed from all my sins and from the person that I'd become. Even though, at 15 I wasn't that evil of a person, but you feel that way, right? And I was ready to take on the world, come what may. I was a child of God. And I felt so close that day that nothing could separate me from the love of the Father. Now, if you've ever been there, at that moment, feeling that close, you don't stay there. Right? Self inevitably creeps back in. And there were times that I felt like I was falling back into old patterns of behavior. But then something would happen and God would break through again. And I'd get those spiritual highs. And I would attain that spiritual high numerous times in my life. Times when my faith was growing and I never experienced that level of relationship before. And it was great. But I would also have these times where I would have these crushing periods of doubt. Where I didn't feel the presence of God. Where I was living for myself and I wasn't seeking the way of the Father. Where I felt like I was just kind of going through the motions. Have you ever been there? Maybe you're there right now. I don't know. Have you ever wondered if something's wrong with you? You try and believe and you try and trust, but you find yourself sometimes in this spiritual desert. Now, last week we began this new series where we're looking at heroes of faith from the Old Testament. Not just so we can admire them and say, oh wow, that was great what they did, but so that we can learn from them, so we might perhaps become maybe even more like them. And we started with Abraham and his response to the call of God in Genesis chapter 12. And maybe if you were here last week, you were thinking, boy, I wish I could be like Abraham. Man, kind of faith that he demonstrated. And when you look more closely, however, at Abraham's relationship with God, what you're going to find is that it was more the roller coaster of faith that you and I experience rather than this kind of steady climb. And sometimes, if all you look at is the call of Abraham in chapter 12 and his unflinching response to say yes to God, you might get this false impression. But the story of Abraham's life is far more complicated than that. He's not a plastic character. He's one who experiences doubt. Faith isn't easy for him. Faith is in fact always a battle. And so the story of Abraham is this tale of victory and defeat. It's a struggle of one man to retain his belief in his God, even in the midst of his growing sense that perhaps God has failed him. And so this morning I want to take a quick survey of some of the stories, the high and low points in his life. So if you have a Bible, we're going to kind of flip through various chapters and kind of do an overview, not deal with any of the stories in depth, but just kind of look at the pattern of his life and see what that looks like. So, starting in chapter 12, immediately after the call of Abraham and this tremendous story of faith, we see a completely different side, a darker side of this hero. For a famine occurs in the land, and Abraham is forced to go to Egypt. And out of fear for his own life, he asks Sarah to say that she is his sister. Because he's worried that, he's going to be killed by the Egyptians who think that Sarah is really, really beautiful and they'll take him from him. So word gets out about the new beauty in town, and Pharaoh does take her into his harem, and Abraham gets compensated with lots and lots of stuff, herds and flocks and goods and all kinds of things, and there's no word of protest or complaint from Abram. And it's only through God's intervention that Sarai is rescued from Pharaoh's hand. And what we see here is Abraham willing to put Sarah in danger to save his own skin. When it comes right down to it, he wants to make sure that he is safe. And he doesn't trust in the promise. He's not sure yet about this new God. But then the very next story, in Genesis 13, we have a different picture of Abraham. Right? So he's rich. In fact, he's so rich that the land can't contain and support both Lot and Abram. and their herds. So strife arises between their herders. And rather than sending Lot off to the lesser fields, Abraham actually gives Lot first choice, right? And he says, look at the land before you. If you go to the right, I'll take the left. If you go to the left, I'll take the right. And Lot, of course, chooses the well-watered plain of the Jordan, which maybe makes us wonder a little bit about his character. But Abraham, in this story, is willing to trust in the promise of the land. He doesn't feel like he has to protect it, like he needs to take it for himself. He doesn't throw the promise of God back in Lot's face and say, well, did God promise you this land like he did me? No. He becomes the generous giver. And then we go on to chapter 15. A few chapters later, God reiterates the promise to Abram, and we see his doubts arise again. So let's look at the first 6 verses here. If you have the text, you can read along with me. Chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. Behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward the heaven and the number of your stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So here in this passage, time has passed, and for Abram, the promise seems no closer a reality than it was when it was first made. And his only vision of the future is to have Eliezer of Damascus, his slave, become kind of his adopted son and therefore his heir. But when God says, not this man, but one of your very own issue shall be your heir, Abram moves from doubt to faith once again, and he believes. And he puts his trust not in the promise, but in the one who promises. But the pattern has already begun to develop, and it continues. Look at chapter 16. After the Lord promises, Abram becomes involved in this kind of act of doubt, and it's actually instigated by Sarah. Right? So here she is trying to help God out by providing a means to fulfill the promise. Right? They're trying to work within the possibilities that they can see and they can understand. And so the promise has been made that one of your very own issues shall be your heir, but Sarah's still barren. And it was a serious matter for a man to be childless in these days because he had no heir. But it was even more serious, it was even worse for a wife, because one of the signs that you were a good wife was that you produced heirs. And so this was a horrendous thing for her. And she's not one to stand around when other options exist. Hagar, her handmaid, is available. And the practice of surrogate motherhood is well attested throughout the ancient Orient, from about the 3rd millennium to the 1st. And so she has this plan, this idea. Abram is now about 85, and the promise is already 10 years old, so he agrees to the plan. Father a child through Hagar. Yet Sarah's attempt to help God out, of course, is an utter failure. After Hagar gives birth to a child, there's a tension between the two women. And Sarah ends up saying, send them off! Now, perhaps this story sounds familiar. Have you ever asked God for a blessing and then tried on your own to make it happen? And worked your own machinations, trying to figure it out and work it out, and then it all kinds of becomes a disaster. Let's move on. Chapter 17. Abraham is now 99 years old. He was 75 when he departed from Haran. He was 86 when Hagar bore Ishmael. And God doesn't seem very prompt in fulfilling the promise. So he's been waiting and waiting and waiting. But that view comes when you look from human eyes, right? When you look as a person, a mortal. Because the delay of the promise is part of the development of Abram's faith. Right? It serves to make it clear that God is the one who is at work, and then when the promise is eventually fulfilled, it's God behind it, and not anything of human origin. So God appears to Abraham once again and confirms the covenant. And the covenant presented here in chapter 17 is kind of the crescendo of all the multiple promises that you see throughout the story of Abram, which have preceded it. And God says for his part, here's what will happen. He says to Abram, you will be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. You will be exceedingly numerous. Kings will come from you. I will be God to you and your offspring, and I will give you this land as a perpetual holding. Now what do you have to do, Abraham? Walk before me and be blameless. That's his part. And then he gives Abraham instructions for the sign of the covenant, the practice of circumcision. Kind of an odd sign, by the way. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Have you ever wondered about that scene where Abraham comes back from his vision or dream or conversation with God or whatever it was and tries to explain to his household about this new sign of the covenant? Coming to his servants, knife in hand, and telling them what he's about to do. And their response, you're going to do what? With that? Where? You know, it'd be an odd kind of thing to try and explain that one. But God says it's through Sarah that I will give you a son. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. And this taxes Abraham's faith to the limits. So notice here in verse 17 that Abraham laughs in the face of God. He sees the situation as hopeless. He says, Lord, why not just use Ishmael? Right? After all, he is my seed. Let the promises be fulfilled through him. But God says, no. It's going to be through Sarah. And you're going to name this child Isaac, which means he laughs. So that every time he calls the name of his child, Abraham will be reminded of what God accomplished even in the midst of his doubt. And then we come, of course, to the kind of the crescendo chapter 22. There are, of course, other scenes of both faith and failure before we get here, but we're skipping over those. In chapter 22, this is the central story of faith. It's this kind of final move in the pattern. This man who wavered between great faith and doubt must now decide what he's going to do with this God. You see, God wants to know, do you fear God? You can see that in verse 12. This man, who was to be the patriarch of the faithful, must decide for himself whom he will serve. And be sure of this, as we think about this story, although the story begins with the statement that God was testing Abraham, that's for our benefit as readers, recognize that he does not know that. So of all the messages that Abraham received from God, this one, of course, was the most incomprehensible. Sacrifice your son, your only son whom you love. God had taken forever in following through on his promise. He'd finally gotten this issue from Sarah, his own child, and now God is going to take him away, the very hope that he had given. And God isn't seeking to see how much Abraham is willing to give. That's not what this story is about. This story is about God wanting to know if Abraham will trust him even when it makes no sense to trust him. And when Abraham is faced with this profane request, the question is, what will he do? Will he follow the path he followed in Egypt, protecting himself? Or will he once again take the path out of Ur, the path of faith? Now, just a note on this request of God. Of course, to us, it's a horrible request. How could God ever require anybody to sacrifice their own child? And it was a horrendous request and horrifying request to Abraham as well. But it did make perhaps better sense in that context because, of course, sacrifice was the way you honored God back in those days, and human sacrifice was not unknown. So, again, as we emphasized last week, Abraham was brought up in a pagan culture, and he doesn't know this God very well, so this would be not necessarily a bizarre request from a God back then. even though it is for us, right? So what is he going to do? What we see here is Abraham now abandoning himself to God. He builds an altar. He lays the wood. He binds his son. He raises the knife. Not knowing why. Only knowing that God had asked. And he finally has come to trust this unknown God. God has asked, and now Abraham finally will obey, even when it makes no sense. He is now fully and completely the Lord's. But it took a while. So as we think about the life of this spiritual hero, we see both faith and doubt. We see him struggling. And these doubts arise because of the delay of the promise that strains his faith. This new God doesn't act according to his schedule. Doesn't act according to Abraham's sense of how things should be. And the delay causes this growing sense that the promise is impossible to achieve, that it will never really happen. Yet life teaches us that when we look at Abraham, there are some important lessons of faith that we can learn. First of all, faith is a struggle. Right? Abram's not perfect. He had his moments of total failure. At some points he trusts God implicitly, but at other times he takes control in his own hands and he tries to accomplish what only God can accomplish. And throughout it all, God remained faithful. Right? God continues to love him and us in our imperfection. I think many Christians have a lot of insecurity because they never know exactly quite where they stand with God. But here we see a picture of a God who is both persistent and faithful. That even when we are not, he is there. Right? Even when you feel most distant from God, he has not left you. It's not about how you feel. And it's also important to recognize that God allows us to doubt. In fact, doubt, uncertainty, misgivings, questions, reservations are inevitable. And they're healthy in some ways, because doubt helps us prevent dogmatism. Right? Without questioning our faith and our beliefs, we become these unthinking fanatics who don't change and we don't grow. But spiritual growth is a learning process that occurs when we are challenged. Without doubt, there is no room for faith. You see, if all was clear and certain, faith would have no place in our lives. But as it is, we are continually learning to trust God more and more through the experiences and the challenge and the questions and the doubts that we have. As Dostoevsky said, "It is not as a child that I believe and confess Jesus Christ. My Hosanna is born of a furnace of doubt." Yet we have faith in what God has promised, not what we wish or what we want. Right? Think about that. God has not promised us freedom from hardship and heartache. And so when those things come, don't think that God has betrayed you. Finally, we learn from Abraham that faith is a decision. You know, that we don't always feel that spiritual high. God will not always seem close to us. It's like a marriage in which the feelings come and go, but love stays strong. You know, when you're young and when you're first in that relationship, you have this great excitement and adrenaline and that rush of infatuation, and that does not and cannot last. Right? It becomes something far deeper because it's not as unpredictable as emotion. You love because you have chosen to love. Because you are committed to love. And so it is with faith. We choose God. To believe, to trust, to follow, even in the midst of our doubts. I'd like the praise team to come on up. So the final word would be this. If today you sit here amidst your doubts, don't be afraid, it's okay. The real question is, as you think about your spiritual journey, will you follow God even when you don't know where He's taking you and you don't understand why? Let's continue to pray.